The morning began like any other. The sun had risen quietly over the lake, casting a golden reflection across the surface of the water. Birds moved through the trees along the shoreline, and a gentle breeze carried the familiar smell of wet sand and fresh earth. For Daniel, it was supposed to be an ordinary day. He was 38 years old, a husband, a father, and a man who had spent much of his life around water. He had 2 young sons who looked up to him as their strongest protector, the man who could fix almost anything, make them laugh when they were sad, and promise them that everything would be all right. That morning, before leaving home, he kissed his 2 boys goodbye. "Stay together," he told them with a smile. His youngest son laughed. His oldest asked, "When are you coming back, Dad?" "Soon," Daniel answered. Those were the last words his children would ever hear from him. Daniel walked toward the lake with no reason to believe that his life was about to change forever. The water looked calm, beautiful, even. There was nothing on the surface to warn him. No sign, no sound, no visible danger. He stepped into the water. At first, everything seemed normal. The cool water moved around his legs as he walked farther from the shore. He smiled, turned toward the open lake, and began swimming. But something was wrong. Within minutes, Daniel began to feel strangely weak. His breathing became heavier. His arms no longer moved with the same strength. He tried to turn back toward the shore, but his body seemed to be losing control. He called for help. His voice disappeared into the open air. People nearby noticed that something was happening, but by the time they reached him, Daniel was already unconscious. They pulled him from the water and desperately tried to save him. But Daniel never opened his eyes again. He was 38 years old. He had 2 sons waiting for him at home, and they did not know that their father would never walk through the door again. At first, nobody understood what had happened. Daniel had entered the water alive. He had been healthy. He had been swimming. Then, suddenly, he was gone. People began asking questions. What happened to him? Why did he become so weak? What was in the water? As people returned to the lake, they noticed something even more disturbing. Fish were floating on the surface, one after another. Some were already dead. Others were moving slowly through the water before becoming still. The lake that had looked peaceful that morning suddenly seemed terrifying. Rumors spread quickly through the community. Some people said the water had been poisoned. Others believed someone had deliberately contaminated it. Some even whispered that the lake had been bewitched. But fear has a way of turning uncertainty into stories. The truth was still unknown. What everyone could see, however, was that something had gone terribly wrong. The water was no longer simply water. It had become a mystery. And Daniel had become the human face of that mystery. That evening, Daniel's 2 boys sat near the doorway waiting for him. The younger one kept asking when his father would return. The older one was quieter. He seemed to understand that something was wrong. When the news finally reached the family, the house became silent. There are moments when grief is so deep that words become useless. Daniel's wife could barely speak. His youngest son asked the question that broke everyone's heart. "Where is Dad?" Nobody knew how to answer. How do you explain death to a child who was expecting his father to come home? How do you explain that the man who held his hand, carried him, protected him, and promised to return would never return again? The older boy looked toward the door. Perhaps some part of him still expected his father to walk through it. Perhaps he was waiting to hear Daniel's voice. Perhaps he was hoping that someone would suddenly say, "It's all a mistake. Your father is coming home." But nobody said those words. Because they were not true. Daniel was gone, and 2 boys had lost the man they believed would always be there. The following day, people returned to the lake. The scene was heartbreaking. Dead fish covered parts of the water. Their bodies floated silently beneath the morning sun. The same lake that had once provided food, recreation, and life now appeared lifeless. The community began to fear the water. People stopped swimming. Some stopped fishing. Others refused to go near the shoreline. Questions became more urgent. What had entered the water? Was it a chemical? Was it sewage? Was it something naturally occurring? Had someone deliberately contaminated the lake? Nobody could say with certainty. And that uncertainty made the tragedy even more frightening. Because when people do not understand a danger, they cannot easily protect themselves from it. Days passed. Daniel's chair remained empty. His shoes were still where he had left them. His belongings remained inside the house. But the most painful reminder was his children's voices. They still talked about him. They still remembered the little things. The way he laughed. The way he called the names. The way he would tell them stories before they went to sleep. The younger boy eventually stopped asking when his father was coming home. He had begun to understand. And that may have been the saddest part. Children should not have to learn about death so early. They should be thinking about school, games, dreams, and the future. Not funerals. Not contaminated water. Not a father who left one morning and never returned. Daniel's story is not simply a story about one man. It is a warning about how fragile life can become when the environment around us is neglected. Water gives life, but contaminated water can also become a source of disease, suffering, and death. When pollution enters a lake, river, or water supply, the consequences may extend far beyond what we can see. Fish can die, ecosystems can collapse, communities can become exposed to dangerous contaminants. And sometimes, tragedy reaches a human family before anyone understands what is happening. Daniel's death left behind questions that demanded answers. Not rumors, not fear, not superstition. Answers. The water needed to be tested. The source of contamination needed to be identified. The fish needed to be examined. And the community needed to understand what had happened. Because the goal should never be simply to explain a tragedy after it happens. The goal should be to prevent the next one. Months later, Daniel's two sons still remembered that morning. They remembered their father's smile. They remembered his final words. Stay together. And they did. They carried each other through the grief. They grew up knowing that their father had loved them deeply. But they also grew up with a painful question. Could his death have been prevented? Perhaps one day, science would provide the answer. Perhaps the water would reveal its secret. Perhaps the investigation would discover exactly what had killed the fish and taken their father's life. But no scientific report could bring Daniel back. No explanation could erase the empty chair. No answer could replace a father's embrace. And that is what makes his story so heartbreaking. A man entered the water expecting to return home. Instead, he left behind two sons who would spend the rest of their lives remembering him. The lake remained. The water continued to move. The wind continued to pass over its surface. The fish eventually disappeared. But for one family, the lake would never again be just a lake. It would always be the place where a 38-year-old father went swimming. And never came home.